Hey everyone, welcome to this audiobook. Let's get started. Imagine this. You're standing in the grocery store aisle, staring at two nearly identical boxes of cereal. One claims to be high in fiber, the other is low in sugar. You glance back and forth, frozen, unable to decide which one is the smarter choice, and all the while you feel that subtle tug of frustration. Why can something so trivial feel so mentally exhausting? Now, stretch that same feeling to bigger decisions. Should you invest in that new business idea, take a leap in your career, or stay in the familiar safety of your current role? Should you trust your gut when it tells you to take a chance? Or should you carefully weigh every fact and number? If you've ever felt torn between the voice inside you that urges quick, instinctive action and the slower, more deliberate reasoning that whispers for caution, then you're about to discover a groundbreaking framework that explains exactly why your mind works this way and what you can do about it. Welcome to Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist whose decades of research have fundamentally reshaped our understanding of human judgment, decision-making, and the hidden forces that drive the choices we make every single day. This book begins with a simple but life-altering promise. The way you think, the way you decide, and the way you judge the world around you are not nearly as rational, consistent, or controlled as you may believe. Kahneman reveals that within each of us lives not one mind, but two distinct systems of thought. He calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional, and intuitive. It's the voice that finishes your friend's sentence before they do. The part of you that recoils at the sight of a snake before you even process the danger. And the gut instinct that feels effortless but often misleads. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, analytical, and effortful. It's the careful calculator inside you that checks the math twice. That forces you to think through complicated instructions. And that strains to resist the easy but tempting answer. Together, these two systems shape your experience of the world, and more importantly, they shape the decisions that build or break your happiness, your relationships, your financial future, and even the societies we live in. But here is the catch. Though we like to imagine ourselves as rational beings, calmly weighing evidence and choosing wisely, most of the time System 1 is running the show. The fast, intuitive, emotional brain is constantly making snap judgments, taking shortcuts, and leading us down paths that feel right in the moment, but can be catastrophically wrong in the long run. System 2, the slower and more logical counterpart, is fully capable of correcting these errors, but it is lazy, easily fatigued, and often content to rubber-stamp the impulses of System 1 rather than put in the hard mental work. The result is a mind that feels confident, decisive, and logical, while beneath the surface it is riddled with biases, blind spots, and illusions. Kahneman's promise to you, as the listener of this book, is to illuminate these hidden forces so you can recognize them, understand them, and begin to master them. Over the course of this journey, you will learn why people are consistently overconfident in what they know, why we are prone to anchoring our decisions on arbitrary numbers, why loss feels far more painful than the joy of gain, and why our memories of experiences often override the reality of those experiences themselves. You will discover how advertisers, politicians, and even your own friends unconsciously exploit your cognitive shortcuts. And most importantly, you will be given tools, practical, research-backed insights that can help you slow down when it matters most, engage System 2 when decisions are critical, and begin to see the world with sharper clarity. Think of this book as both a mirror and a map. A mirror because it will reflect back to you the surprising, often uncomfortable truth about how your mind actually operates. A map because it will guide you toward wiser choices, deeper awareness, and greater control over the forces that quietly shape your life. Whether you are deciding what to buy at the store, how to negotiate a deal, or whom to trust with your future, the lessons you're about to hear will not only explain why you so often feel torn or misled in the moment, but also show you a way to think better, decide smarter, and live more intentionally. So, as you listen to Thinking Fast and Slow, I invite you to pay attention not only to the fascinating experiments, the witty examples, and the counterintuitive insights, but also to the subtle moments in your own life when you catch your mind at work, speeding ahead with confidence or dragging its feet in deliberation. Because once you see the two systems clearly, you can never unsee them. And with that awareness comes the power to navigate your decisions with greater wisdom and far less regret. This is not just a book about psychology. It is a book about you, your mind, and the choices that define your life. And that journey begins now. Part 1. Two systems. Making machine, but rather a constant interplay between two distinct modes of thought that Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. And to grasp this distinction is to unlock the key to understanding why you think the way you do, why you make the choices you make, and why you are often far less in control of your own decisions than you imagine yourself to be. System 1 is the fast thinker, the automatic pilot of the mind, always on, effortless, intuitive, and emotional. It is the system that allows you to instantly recognize a friend's face in a crowd, to complete the phrase peanut butter, and/or to jump back from the curb when a car speeds by. And it works through patterns, associations, and heuristics or mental shortcuts that give you quick answers with minimal effort. In contrast, System 2 is the slow thinker, the deliberate, analytical, and effortful processor. It is the system that wakes up when you solve a math problem, like 17 times 24, that struggles when you try to park in a tight space, that engages when you check whether an argument actually makes logical sense. And unlike System 1, it is not automatic. It requires focus, concentration, and above all, energy. Now, the big promise of this part of the book is not merely to label these two systems, but to show you the subtle yet profound ways they interact, how they shape nearly every moment of your life, and why their relationship, far from equal or balanced, is lopsided. With System 1 often driving your behavior, while System 2, though capable of overriding it, usually prefers the path of least resistance, conserving effort, and simply endorsing whatever the fast, intuitive System 1 has already offered. What Kahneman reveals is that much of what you think of as your reasoning is in fact your slower, more deliberate system rubber-stamping the conclusions of your quicker, more impulsive one. And this leads to a world of consequences, from snap judgments that feel right but are deeply flawed, to errors in perception and memory that feel certain but are riddled with bias, to choices that can be predictably irrational yet hard to resist. To make this distinction vivid, Kahneman gives us experiments, stories, and examples such as the famous bat and ball problem. A bat and a ball together cost 1/10. The bat costs one more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? Most people relying on System 1 instinctively answer 10 cents. Because the figure jumps to mind quickly, it feels right, and it requires no effort. Yet the correct answer is 5 cents. And only when you slow down, engage System 2, and check the math carefully, do you realize the intuitive response is wrong. This simple exercise captures the essence of the two systems at work. The fast intuitive guess versus the slower, more effortful correction. Kahneman also shows how these systems extend beyond puzzles and into the very fabric of daily life. System 1 is the storyteller spinning coherent narratives out of limited information, making you feel as if you understand situations even when your knowledge is fragmentary. It is the source of your gut feelings, your quick impressions of people, your snap judgments about risk and reward, and it operates through heuristics that save time but often distort reality. System 2, by contrast, is the skeptic, the checker, the one that can interrogate those stories, demand evidence, and apply rules of logic. But because it is effortful, it cannot and does not monitor everything. Instead, it acts like a supervisor who steps in only when necessary, and often it simply accepts the suggestions of System 1, even when those suggestions are biased or flat out wrong. The promise of this part is that by understanding how System 1 and System 2 work, and more importantly, how they miswork, you will begin to see patterns in your own thinking that were previously invisible. You will see why you are so easily swayed by first impressions, why confidence is often mistaken for accuracy, why you underestimate uncertainty, and why your mind, in its quest for efficiency, sacrifices accuracy without your awareness. Kahneman does not promise that you can eliminate these errors because System 1 cannot be turned off and System 2 cannot monitor every thought. But he does promise that awareness can give you leverage, a chance to catch yourself in the act, to know when to slow down, to realize that what feels obvious may be misleading and that what feels certain may be an illusion. Another critical theme in Part 1 is the concept of cognitive ease, the idea that when something feels easy to process, we are more likely to trust it, believe it, and accept it, regardless of its truth. System 1 thrives on cognitive ease. It prefers simple stories, familiar ideas, and patterns that flow smoothly. And when things are easy, it signals comfort and confidence. System 2, on the other hand, is more likely to activate when we feel cognitive strain, when a task demands effort, when something doesn't quite fit the easy story. But because ease feels good and effort feels unpleasant, our minds are biased toward accepting the easy and avoiding the hard, often leading us to accept flawed reasoning simply because it is easier than digging deeper. Kahneman's ultimate message in Part 1 is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it shows us that our minds are not nearly as rational or in control as we like to think. And liberating because by naming and understanding these two systems, we can begin to catch ourselves, to anticipate the traps, and to apply our mental energy more wisely. This part sets the stage for everything that follows, promising that once you understand the dance between System 1 and System 2, you will see the hidden architecture of your own thought processes. And with that insight, you can start to make better choices, not by erasing your instincts, but by knowing when to trust them and when to challenge them. Part 2 of Thinking Fast and Slow is titled Heuristics and Biases, and here Daniel Kahneman brings us into the very heart of his research, the core insights that not only won him the Nobel Prize, but also changed forever how economists, psychologists, and ordinary people alike understand human judgment and decision-making. And this section delivers a promise that is both unsettling and empowering. Unsettling because it shows us that our minds, particularly System 1 with its fast, intuitive judgments, are not merely prone to occasional mistakes, but systematically biased in ways that are predictable, repeatable, and often invisible to us. And empowering because by shining a light on these biases, we can begin to recognize them in action, defend ourselves against their most damaging effects, and learn when to trust our instincts and when to pause, slow down, and think more carefully. At its core, this part explains how heuristics, mental shortcuts that our brains rely on to make quick judgments, are both a blessing and a curse. They are a blessing because without them, we could not survive. They allow us to navigate a complex world without being paralyzed by the endless flood of information, and they help us make sense of situations rapidly, giving us rules of thumb that usually work well enough. But they are also a curse, because these shortcuts are not precise, they are not logically rigorous, and they often substitute easy questions for hard ones, giving us answers that feel right but are dangerously flawed. Kahneman's central promise in this part is to expose those flaws, to show you how and why they occur, and to demonstrate how deeply they influence not only trivial choices, but also major decisions in finance, medicine, politics, and every sphere of life where human judgment plays a role. One of the first heuristics Kahneman introduces is the availability heuristic, the mental shortcut by which we judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can quickly recall dramatic instances of plane crashes on the news, you may judge air travel as more dangerous than it really is, even though statistically it is far safer than driving. If stories of shark attacks dominate headlines, you may overestimate their frequency compared to far more common but less publicized dangers, like drowning in a swimming pool. The key insight here is that availability is not the same as probability, but System 1 treats them as if they are, and because vivid, emotional, or recent events are easier to recall, they exert a disproportionate influence on our perception of risk. Closely related to availability is the representativeness heuristic, which drives us to judge probabilities based on how much something resembles a typical case. For example, if you hear a description of a quiet, bookish man who enjoys poetry, you might assume he is more likely to be a librarian than a farmer, even though farmers vastly outnumber librarians. The error lies in ignoring base rates, the actual statistical frequencies in the world, and instead relying on stereotypes and patterns that System 1 finds compelling. Kahneman shows us how this bias leads to systematic mistakes, such as neglecting the importance of prior probabilities in favor of the story that feels most representative, and he demonstrates how difficult it is for System 2 to override these intuitive judgments once they take hold. Another crucial bias Kahneman explores is anchoring, the phenomenon in which arbitrary numbers exert a powerful pull on our estimates and decisions. When asked whether the population of Turkey is greater or less than 20 million, and then asked to guess the actual number, people's answers are far lower than if the initial anchor had been 80 million, even though the anchor has no logical relevance. Anchors can come from external suggestions like a random number on a roulette wheel, or from internal calculations like your own first rough guess. But either way, they bias subsequent thinking in a predictable direction. Anchoring illustrates the fundamental vulnerability of System 1. It is highly suggestible, easily swayed, and its first impressions linger even when they are demonstrably irrelevant. Then comes substitution, the process by which our mind replaces a difficult question with an easier one without our conscious awareness. When asked, "How happy are you with your life?" you might substitute, "How happy do I feel right now?" When asked, "How likely is this politician to succeed?" you might substitute, "How charismatic does this politician seem?" This substitution happens instantly and effortlessly, and the danger is not that we substitute, but that we do so without realizing it, confidently answering the wrong question while believing we've addressed the right one. Kahneman also explains the illusion of validity, our tendency to be overconfident in judgments based on patterns that feel coherent, but are in fact unreliable. For instance, stock market traders may feel certain that their intuition about a stock's future is correct because they see patterns in short-term fluctuations, yet extensive research shows their predictions perform no better than chance. This illusion of skill and validity is fueled by System 1's love for stories that make sense and System 2's laziness in failing to scrutinize whether those stories are actually grounded in evidence. Perhaps one of the most consequential biases covered here is overconfidence, the belief that we know more than we do and can predict the future more accurately than we can. Kahneman shows how this bias permeates fields from investing to politics to everyday life, leading people to underestimate uncertainty, take unwarranted risks, and ignore the role of chance and outcomes. Overconfidence is seductive because it gives us a sense of control and certainty, but it is also dangerous because it blinds us to the limits of our knowledge. The promise of Part 2, then, is to give you a toolkit for recognizing these patterns, not in the abstract, not in someone else's laboratory experiments, but in your own daily thinking. By seeing how heuristics like availability, representativeness, and anchoring shape your judgments, and by becoming aware of biases like substitution, overconfidence, and the illusion of validity, you gain the power to pause, to engage System 2, and to ask the questions that System 1 would rather avoid. You will not eliminate these biases because they are built into the architecture of human thought, but you can learn to anticipate them, to create safeguards against their most harmful effects, and to make better, more rational decisions in the moments that matter most. Part 3 of Thinking Fast and Slow is titled Overconfidence, and here Daniel Kahneman takes us deeper into one of the most striking and, at times, dangerous flaws in human judgment, the almost universal tendency to place far more trust in the accuracy of our knowledge, our predictions, and our decisions than the evidence actually justifies. This part makes a bold and unsettling promise. It reveals that much of what we call confidence is not a reliable signal of truth, but rather an illusion constructed by our minds, an illusion born out of the storytelling nature of System 1 and the complacency of System 2. And it shows us that even experts, perhaps especially experts, are not immune to these errors. The big message is that while confidence feels good, feels convincing, and feels persuasive, it is often a poor guide to what is real. And if we are not careful, it can lead to misjudgments that cost us dearly, whether in business, in investing, in leadership, or in our personal lives. Kahneman begins by pointing out that the human mind is a storyteller. It craves coherence, patterns, and causality. When something happens, we want to know why, and we quickly weave narratives that make events seem logical, inevitable, and predictable, even when chance and randomness played an enormous role. This tendency is known as the illusion of understanding, the belief that we comprehend past events better than we really do. For instance, after a company succeeds, analysts retroactively explain the triumph as the obvious result of strong leadership, sound strategy, or bold vision. But if the company had failed, the very same analysts might have confidently pointed to those identical factors as the cause of its downfall. The truth, which System 1 resists, is that much of what happens in life is shaped by luck, randomness, and unpredictable factors we cannot see, yet our mind smooths over the chaos with neat stories that make us feel as if we understand more than we do. Linked to this is the hindsight bias, the well-documented tendency to see events as having been more predictable than they actually were once we know the outcome. Think of the stock market crash of 2008. After it happened, many people claimed they had seen it coming, even though very few actually did, and those who predicted disaster often had been doing so for years without accuracy. Hindsight gives us the false impression that the past was clear, the future is knowable, and our judgments are sharper than they really are. Kahneman's promise here is to unmask this illusion, to show that our confidence in hindsight is not evidence of foresight, but simply the mind rewriting the story in a way that feels consistent. Another major theme in this part is the illusion of validity, where people place great trust in their own judgments, even when those judgments are based on weak or irrelevant information. Kahneman shares examples from his own career, such as when he and colleagues confidently rated candidates for officer training based on short interviews, only to find later that their ratings had almost no predictive power. Despite repeated evidence of failure, they still felt strongly that their impressions were valid each time they interviewed someone new. This is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a universal human trait. Whenever patterns seem to emerge, whenever a story feels coherent, System 1 convinces us that our judgment is sound, and System 2, being lazy, rarely steps in to challenge this feeling. This leads naturally into one of the most sobering revelations of Part 3. Expert intuition is often much less reliable than we believe. Kahneman distinguishes between two kinds of environments. Ones that are kind, where patterns are stable, feedback is immediate, and practice can truly hone intuition, such as learning to play chess or becoming skilled at firefighting, and ones that are wicked, where feedback is delayed, outcomes are noisy, and patterns are misleading, such as financial markets, political forecasting, or stock picking. In wicked environments, even experts with years of experience may develop strong but unfounded confidence in their judgments, mistaking random success for skill. The promise here is to equip you with the skepticism to recognize where intuition can be trusted and where it cannot, a skill that can protect you from misplaced faith in experts or even in your own gut instincts. Kahneman also introduces the concept of the planning fallacy, a particularly insidious form of overconfidence that occurs when individuals and organizations underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits. Think of public projects that balloon far beyond budget, construction deadlines that double or triple, or personal goals like writing a book or starting a diet that take much longer than we anticipated. The planning fallacy arises because we focus too narrowly on the specific project at hand, ignoring the base rates of how similar projects have fared in the past. System 1 tells a rosy, coherent story of success, and System 2 fails to push back with the cold, statistical truth. The promise here is that by becoming aware of the planning fallacy, and by forcing ourselves to adopt what Kahneman calls the outside view, looking at how similar endeavors typically unfold, we can counteract this bias and make more realistic plans. Another key bias covered in this section is the illusion of skill, particularly in the world of finance and investing. Kahneman presents evidence showing that most fund managers do not consistently outperform the market, and yet they and their clients remain convinced of their superior skill. The uncomfortable truth is that much of what looks like skill is simply luck. But because the mind dislikes randomness and craves coherent explanations, both the managers and the investors interpret streaks of good performance as proof of genuine expertise. Kahneman's promise in addressing this is not to strip away all faith in experts, but to encourage a more realistic evidence view of where true skill exists and where confidence is misplaced. The overarching promise of Part 3 is to make you deeply skeptical of confidence as a signal of truth, whether in yourself or in others. Confidence, Kahneman insists, is a feeling, not evidence, and it arises whenever a story feels coherent and no contradictions are immediately visible. But the absence of doubt does not mean the presence of accuracy. It simply means System 1 has generated a story that System 2 has not challenged. The empowering message is that by learning to separate the feeling of confidence from the reality of accuracy, by seeking external evidence, by considering base rates, and by adopting the outside view, we can guard ourselves against the predictable errors that overconfidence leads to. Part 4 of Thinking Fast and Slow is titled Choices, and in this section, Daniel Kahneman turns his attention to the practical implications of human judgment for decision-making under uncertainty, risk, and reward, guiding us into a world where our intuitions, preferences, and values are not as stable or rational as we would like to believe. The big promise of this part is both ambitious and deeply transformative. It asserts that the choices we make, whether about money, life, careers, or personal relationships, are heavily influenced by cognitive biases, framing effects, and emotional responses that often operate below conscious awareness, and that by understanding the systematic ways our judgment is skewed, we can begin to anticipate, correct, and even design better decisions for ourselves and for others, moving closer to choices that align with our true values rather than the misleading signals of intuition. Kahneman begins by contrasting traditional economic theory with the empirical realities of human behavior, highlighting the limitations of the rational agent model that dominates classical economics. In theory, humans are expected to make choices based on consistent preferences, weighing costs, benefits, probabilities, and outcomes with careful calculation. Deviate dramatically from these assumptions. System 1, the fast, intuitive, and emotionally driven component of our mind, dominates in most day-to-day decisions, producing answers that feel immediate, compelling, and coherent, but which often violate the axioms of rational choice. System 2, the slower, analytical, and deliberative component, can intervene, but only when prompted, motivated, or trained to do so, meaning that in the majority of real-world scenarios, our choices are guided more by heuristics and biases than by careful deliberation. One of the central insights Kahneman explores in this part is the concept of prospect theory, which he developed with Amos Tversky as an alternative to expected utility theory. Prospect theory captures the empirical patterns of how people evaluate gains and losses, revealing that humans do not treat positive and negative outcomes symmetrically. Specifically, losses loom larger than gains, meaning that the pain of losing 100 is psychologically stronger than the pleasure of gaining 100. This asymmetry, known as loss aversion, has profound consequences for decision-making. It explains why people are often risk-averse when facing potential gains, but risk-seeking when attempting to avoid losses, why investors hold on to losing stocks too long while selling winners too quickly, and why we overvalue the status quo, preferring what we already have even when superior alternatives exist. The promise here is to give listeners a framework for recognizing when loss aversion is shaping their decisions and how to adjust for it to make choices that better serve their long-term interests. Closely related is the idea of reference points, which Kahneman emphasizes as central to understanding preferences. People do not evaluate outcomes in isolation. Rather, they compare them to a subjective baseline, a reference point, which may be the current state, an expected outcome, or even a social comparison. A salary increase may feel rewarding if it surpasses your reference point, but disappointing if it falls short of expectations, even if the objective amount is generous. Similarly, framing the way choices are presented can drastically alter decisions. The same gamble described as a 90 chance of success versus a 10 chance of failure elicits wildly different responses, despite the objective probabilities being identical. Kahneman's promise here is that by understanding how framing and reference points manipulate perception, listeners can consciously reframe problems, recognize hidden influences, and approach choices with clearer judgment rather than emotional reaction. Kahneman also explores the interplay of risk and certainty, showing how humans respond not only to probabilities, but to the way outcomes are described, perceived, and anticipated. In studies known as the certainty effect, People overweight outcomes that are certain relative to those that are merely probable, leading to risk-averse behavior when success is guaranteed, and risk-seeking behavior when all options carry uncertainty. This psychological distortion explains many puzzling economic behaviors, from gambling patterns to investment strategies, and the promise of this insight is that by becoming aware of these biases, individuals can calibrate their choices to better reflect their true preferences rather than being manipulated by the cognitive quirks of System 1. Another fascinating insight in this section is the distinction between experienced utility and decision utility. Experienced utility refers to the actual pleasure, satisfaction, or pain we feel from outcomes, whereas decision utility refers to the perceived value that guides our choices in anticipation of those outcomes. Humans are notoriously poor at predicting their future happiness or dissatisfaction. We misjudge how long positive events will sustain us and how sharply negative events will affect us. Kahneman's research shows that our remembered experiences, particularly the peak-end rule, dominate our recollection and thus influence future choices far more than the total duration or objective quality of experiences. For example, when recalling a vacation, we tend to remember the most intense moment and the final moment, and our evaluation of the entire trip is shaped disproportionately by those memories. The promise here is that by understanding the difference between experienced and decision utility, listeners can make choices that more accurately align with actual well, rather than being misled by distorted memories or anticipatory illusions. The part also delves into mental accounting, a phenomenon in which people treat money and outcomes differently depending on arbitrary categories or labels, violating the principle of fungibility. We may splurge with a windfall bonus while being frugal with salary money, or treat entertainment expenses separately from savings, even when the objective value of money is identical. These biases show how System 1 constructs mental compartments that influence behavior, often leading to suboptimal financial and personal decisions. Kahneman's promise here is to make listeners aware of these hidden accounts and the irrational choices they foster, enabling more coherent and rational decision-making in personal finance, career planning, and resource allocation. Throughout this section, Kahneman consistently demonstrates that our choices are far less rational than they appear, shaped by emotion, cognitive shortcuts, social context, and subtle framing effects. Yet, the empowering promise of this part is that by recognizing these systematic patterns, by distinguishing between intuitive responses and deliberate analysis, and by questioning the assumptions embedded in our decisions, we can regain some control over how we choose. The insights provided here are not theoretical. They are directly applicable to everyday life, from negotiating a salary to selecting an investment portfolio, from planning a major life transition to simply deciding what to eat or how to spend time. Pay attention not only to the research findings and examples, but also to your own reactions, preferences, and decision patterns. Observe where loss aversion, reference points, framing effects, or distorted memories may have steered your choices without your awareness. The journey through choices is a call to mindfulness in decision-making, a call to slow down when it matters, to question the intuitive pull of System 1, to leverage the analytical power of System 2, and ultimately to make decisions that better reflect your real values, long goals, and genuine well. Kahneman's promise is that by understanding the cognitive architecture behind choice, you gain not just knowledge, but practical tools to navigate life's uncertainties with greater clarity, confidence, and wisdom. Part 5 of Thinking, Fast and Slow, titled Two Selves, brings the book to its most profoundly human and personal exploration, delving into the distinction between two ways we experience life and make judgments about it, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and offering a transformative promise that by understanding the difference between the life we live moment by moment and the life we recall and evaluate, we can begin to reconcile our decisions with what truly brings satisfaction, happiness, and meaning, rather than being misled by faulty memory, flawed intuition, or momentary pleasures that fail to leave a lasting imprint. Kahneman reveals that much of the way we think about well-being, satisfaction, and the quality of our lives is dominated not by the reality of our lived experiences, but by the stories we construct about them, and that by disentangling these two selves, we gain a rare insight into what it means to live well and make choices that truly serve us. At the core of this part is the distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the present, perceives sensations, emotions, and events as they occur, and evaluates life moment by moment. This self feels pleasure, pain, joy, and sorrow in real time, and its judgments are continuous and fluid, reflecting the actual quality of the moment. The remembering self, by contrast, evaluates life retrospectively. It constructs a narrative of our experiences, selectively attending to peaks of intensity, final moments, and coherent stories, while ignoring the majority of ordinary, uneventful moments that actually make up most of life. Kahneman's big promise in introducing this distinction is to show that the remembering self often dominates decision-making. When we plan, anticipate, or evaluate our lives, we act based on what we will remember and how we will feel about the story of our life, not the raw reality of our moment-to-moment experiences. Understanding this divide provides a framework for aligning decisions with true well-being, rather than the misleading signals of memory or anticipation. A key concept Kahneman presents is the peak-end rule, which explains that the remembering self evaluates experiences primarily based on the most intense moments, the peaks, and the final moments, largely ignoring duration and the totality of experience. For example, a medical procedure that is extremely painful for an hour, but ends with a gradual, less intense discomfort, may be remembered as less aversive than a shorter procedure with consistent moderate pain throughout, simply because the peak-end pattern in memory produces a more favorable narrative. This has profound implications for choices ranging from healthcare decisions to vacations, parenting, and work experiences. What we remember shapes future decisions far more than what we actually lived through. The promise here is that by becoming aware of the peak-end rule, we can structure experiences in ways that improve the remembered quality of life and thus influence future choices in a manner consistent with genuine satisfaction. Kahneman also explores duration neglect, the idea that the remembering self largely ignores the length of experiences, focusing instead on their intensity and endings. A 2-week vacation with some low points and one spectacular day will be remembered more for that peak than for the relative number of mediocre or dull moments. Similarly, in career, relationships, or investments, we often evaluate success or failure based on select highlights, rather than the overall trajectory, which can distort decision-making if we allow remembered experiences to dominate our planning. The promise of this insight is practical. By understanding the selective attention of the remembering self, we can better anticipate how choices will be recalled, and we can design experiences, routines, and decisions that maximize satisfaction when it truly matters, the way our life will be remembered. Another major insight in this part is the tension between life satisfaction and moment happiness. Kahneman demonstrates that people often overvalue what the remembering self perceives and undervalue the ongoing experiences of the present. For example, someone may pursue a high-status job for years, believing it will produce happiness when reflected upon in memory, while the actual daily experience may be stressful, draining, and joyless. And conversely, small pleasures, leisurely routines, or meaningful social connections may provide substantial moment-to-moment satisfaction that is underrepresented in memory. The big promise of understanding this tension is that by recognizing which self is driving our choices, we can make decisions that align with either immediate well-being or long-term remembered satisfaction, or, ideally, design lives that honor both. Kahneman also addresses how choices for the future are often dominated by anticipated memory, not actual experience. When people plan vacations, medical treatments, or even social interactions, they tend to predict their satisfaction based on how the experience will be remembered, leading to choices that may prioritize striking or dramatic experiences over consistent, steady enjoyment. This demonstrates that human decision-making is often guided less by real-time hedonic experience and more by narrative construction. And the promise here is that by distinguishing between these two drivers, we can more intentionally plan experiences, investments, and relationships to optimize for what actually matters rather than for what only seems memorable. Furthermore, Kahneman emphasizes the limitations of self-reported well-being measures, highlighting that asking people how happy they feel often captures the perspective of the remembering self rather than the experiencing self. Research using the day reconstruction method, where individuals report moment-to-moment experiences over a day, shows a striking divergence between life as lived and life as recalled. People systematically misestimate their true daily happiness, underestimating or overestimating the quality of experiences, often because the remembering self filters reality through stories, coherence, and peaks. The promise here is that by using careful, empirically informed methods, we can better understand our own experiences and the experiences of others, moving beyond flawed intuition and unreliable memory to make choices that reflect actual well-being. Ultimately, Part 5 promises a profound shift in perspective. It challenges the listener to confront the idea that life is experienced in two ways, as it is lived and as it is remembered, and that meaningful choices must navigate both realities. Kahneman encourages the cultivation of awareness, to notice when decisions are being driven by anticipated memory rather than lived experience, to recognize the peaks and ends that disproportionately shape our retrospective evaluations, and to reconcile moment-to-moment enjoyment with long-term satisfaction. He also implicitly offers a liberating insight. While we cannot eliminate the biases of memory, we can design our lives and decisions to maximize both the quality of the experiences we live and the stories we will tell, aligning the two selves in ways that produce genuine, enduring well-being. This final part, therefore, is not only the culmination of Kahneman's scientific exploration of human thought, but also a guide for practical living. It reveals that the mind is a storyteller, our memory is selective, and our satisfaction is constructed. Yet with understanding comes agency. By recognizing the divide between the experiencing self and the remembering self, by observing how peaks, ends, and narratives dominate recall, and by carefully structuring experiences to honor both selves, we gain the promise of a life lived more intentionally, with choices that are not merely the product of fast intuition or biased memory, but reflections of deliberate thought, conscious awareness, and true insight into what brings happiness and meaning. Conclusion. As we draw this journey to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on the immense insights Daniel Kahneman has offered us through Thinking, Fast and Slow, a work that is as much a guide to understanding ourselves as it is a compendium of decades of groundbreaking research in psychology, decision science, and behavioral economics. And the promise of this book is profound. It reveals the invisible architecture of the human mind, exposing the interplay between our fast, intuitive, and often deceptive System 1 and our slower, deliberative, and effortful System 2. And in doing so, it equips us with the knowledge to recognize, understand, and, where possible, correct the predictable errors, biases, and illusions that shape nearly every choice we make, from trivial daily decisions to life-altering investments, career moves, and personal judgments. Throughout this book, Kahneman has guided us through a sweeping landscape of human thought. In Part 1, Two Systems, we learn the foundational distinction that our mind operates simultaneously on two levels: the automatic, effortless, and intuitive System 1, which generates impressions, feelings, and snap judgments, and the slow, analytical, and resource-intensive System 2, which has the power to monitor, correct, and reason through complexity, but is inherently lazy and often content to endorse the conclusions of System 1. From the very first chapter, the book promises that by seeing these systems clearly, we gain the power to detect when we are being led astray by intuition, when our judgments are being shaped unconsciously, and when deliberate effort can produce superior outcomes. In Part 2, Heuristics and Biases, we encountered the many systematic errors that arise from the shortcuts our minds take to manage complexity. Here, Kahneman illuminated the mechanisms behind availability, representativeness, substitution, and anchoring, demonstrating that our intuitions, while essential for navigating daily life, are prone to distortion and misjudgment. The promise of this section is that awareness of these mental shortcuts and biases does not merely entertain or inform, It provides a toolkit for recognizing when our intuition may mislead us, allowing us to intervene, engage System 2, and make more accurate decisions in areas ranging from finance to interpersonal relationships. Part 3 of Understanding Hindsight Bias and the Dangers of Overestimating Skill in Environments Dominated by Randomness, as well as the planning fallacy that leads both individuals and organizations to underestimate costs, risks, and time requirements. The promise here is practical and transformative. By recognizing the limitations of our knowledge and the seductive pull of certainty, we can temper overconfidence, evaluate our decisions more realistically, and approach uncertainty with humility, curiosity, and caution, reducing the likelihood of costly mistakes and poor judgment. In Part 4, Choices, Kahneman explored the ways in which our perceptions of gains, losses, probabilities, and risks shape the decisions we make, often in ways that violate the assumptions of classical rationality. With the introduction of prospect theory, loss aversion, the peak-end rule, and the distinction between experienced and decision utility, we came to understand that human decision-making is not purely mathematical or logical, but deeply psychological, shaped by emotion framing and memory. The promise of this section is that once we recognize the patterns of bias and distortion that influence our choices, we gain the ability to design better decisions, align them with our true values, and anticipate the ways our own cognitive architecture will shape our perception of risk, reward, and satisfaction. Finally, in Part 5, Two Selves, we reach the profoundly personal core of the book, where Kahneman introduced the experiencing self and the remembering self, demonstrating that our evaluation of life is dominated by memory, narrative, and selective recall rather than the continuous reality of lived experience. Through concepts such as duration neglect, the peak-end rule, and the tension between moment-to-moment happiness and retrospective life satisfaction, we learn that much of what we value, pursue, and plan for is driven by the remembered story of our life rather than the lived reality. The promise here is extraordinary. By understanding the dynamics of these two selves, we can design experiences, relationships, and decisions that honor both real satisfaction and long-remembered well, giving us the tools to live a life that is not only coherent in memory, but meaningful in experience. Taken together, the overarching promise of thinking, fast and slow, is nothing less than the promise of self-mastery through understanding. It challenges us to recognize the invisible forces that shape our thoughts, judgments, and decisions, to detect where we are vulnerable to error, and to apply deliberate reasoning when it matters most. It empowers us to navigate the tension between intuition and deliberation, to recognize when confidence is misleading, when heuristics serve us, and when they betray us, and to make choices that reflect both wisdom and insight, rather than the unconscious biases that so often dominate our thinking. Kahneman does not promise perfection. He acknowledges the limits of human cognition, but he does promise clarity, awareness, and the possibility of better judgment, and in doing so he offers a guide for thinking more deliberately, acting more rationally, and living with greater self. Ultimately, the legacy of this book is its transformative perspective. Life is not simply about what we choose, but how we think about those choices, how we interpret outcomes, and how we reconcile the fast, intuitive reactions of System 1 with the slower, reflective processes of System 2. By internalizing the lessons of this book, by observing our biases, by understanding the two selves, and by practicing deliberate reflection, we are equipped to make decisions that are wiser, to live with greater clarity, and to approach uncertainty with humility and intelligence. If this summary has helped you uncover the hidden patterns of thought that govern your life, if you have gained insight into your own mind, and if you are excited to explore more transformative books in this same engaging audiobook format, don't forget to like and share this video. And for more expertly narrated summaries of the world's most impactful books, subscribe to Cliff Note Chronicles, your gateway to knowledge, insight, and practical wisdom delivered directly to your ears, helping you think smarter, decide better, and live more intentionally.